Marcus was an ordinary young man who worked at a local cafe and spent time with friends discussing horror films. He was passionate about this topic, collected rare film recordings, and was always the one who found the most creepy stories. One day, while working, he heard from a colleague that there was an antique store nearby that sold strange and creepy things. According to rumors, this store accepted old dolls, strange photographs, and other items with a past. Interested in this, Marcus decided that he would look there over the weekend, hoping to find something really scary for his collection. Saturday came, and Marcus went to the store as planned. It was hidden in one of the old districts of the city, where tourists or locals rarely visited. The store turned out to be small, littered with all sorts of antiques, from massive chests to portraits of people who had died long ago. There was a long, slightly dusty table in the corner of the store, on which boxes of various items were laid out. Among them, Marcus noticed a small Ouija board, an old, worn board with almost erased symbols. Its surface seemed somehow unusual, as if soaked in time. Without hesitation, he picked it up. This was the famous Ouija board, with which, according to old stories, it was possible to communicate with spirits. But for Marcus, it was just a funny souvenir, nothing more. He didn't believe in mysticism, and all he cared about was how scary his new find on the shelf might look. While Marcus was examining the board, an old photograph attached to the board caught his eye. It was a black and white picture of a group of children dressed in clown costumes. They were all standing in a circle around a figure, but it was too blurry to tell exactly what was depicted. The clowns looked strange. Their smiles were too wide and their eyes too empty. On the back of the photo was written, "Don't wake them up. They know the way to you." Marcus grinned, deciding that this was just part of some old performance. He bought a board and a photo and went home, unaware that this decision would be the beginning of his worst nightmare. When Marcus returned home, he put the board and the photo on the shelf, where his collection of creepy objects was already located. Old dolls with cracked faces, dried roses in jars, and other things that his friends thought were strange, but he perceived as elements of his hobby. In the evening, sitting in an armchair with a cup of coffee, Marcus decided to look at his purchase again. The photo continued to intrigue him. The clowns depicted on it looked more and more strange the more he looked at them. Details began to emerge. Each clown seemed strangely deformed. Their arms were unnaturally long, their faces were twisted. But what really bothered him was the figure in the center of the circle. Her outline remained blurred, as if the photograph was deliberately avoiding showing who it was. Marcus shook his head and put the picture back on the shelf, thinking it was all his imagination. But with every passing minute, the feeling of unease grew. He began to notice minor oddities. For example, it was as if a faint smell of burnt rubber filled the room. And there was a vague rustling that came from one side of the room, then from the other. "I'm just tired," Marcus told himself and decided to distract himself by turning on the movie. But soon the sounds became louder, and he felt that the air in the room became heavier, as if it had thickened. Marcus got up from his chair and headed for the shelf, feeling a strange inner tension. Taking the Ouija board in his hands, he felt how its surface was slightly warmer than everything around. It was strange. The board had obviously been lying in a cold room for a long time. Suddenly the phone rang in the silence. Marcus flinched. The phone fell out of his hands. The bell continued to ring until he picked up the receiver. It was his friend Dylan. "Hi, are you home?" Dylan asked, sounding concerned. "You were going to stop by my place." Marcus glanced at his watch. He had indeed promised to visit Dylan in the evening, but lost track of time, carried away by his new finds. "Yes, sorry, I was busy," Marcus replied. "I'll be right there." After he hung up, he took one last look at the shelf with the black board and the photo. Before leaving, he turned and looked at the door, as if something invisible was making him hesitate. He wanted to leave, but there was also a feeling that he had to stay. Something was stopping him. He went outside, and the evening chill refreshed him, but the feeling of a strange presence did not let go. Even sitting at the wheel of his car, Marcus felt that something was left in his apartment, that it was something looking at him through the walls. Marcus pushed these thoughts away, trying to calm down, But as he approached Dylan's house, he realized more and more that this evening would not be as ordinary as he wanted. Dylan met him at the door, and noticing the strange expression on his friend's face, asked, "Is everything okay? You look like something happened." "Yes, I'm probably just tired," Marcus replied, trying not to attach importance to his feelings. They went inside and Dylan offered them coffee. Sitting at the table and talking about movies, Marcus relaxed a little. But then Dylan suddenly asked, "You bought something new recently, right? You talked about this on the phone, didn't you?" Marcus froze for a second, trying to remember when he had told Dylan about his purchase. He couldn't remember such a conversation. "Yes, but I don't remember telling you that," Marcus replied carefully. Dylan looked puzzled. "I clearly remember that you told me about some kind of blackboard and a creepy photo with clowns. You also said she smells weird." "Mark, are you okay? Maybe you should give up this hobby for a while?" Marcus froze. Smell, burnt rubber. His heart was pounding wildly. He definitely had that smell at home, but he didn't say a word about it to Dylan. How did he know? And then, like lightning, the realization came. All the weirdness started after he brought home the board and the photo. The heavy air, the rustling, the call from Dylan, who seemed to know more than he should have. It's like it's all connected. "Did you tell me that?" Marcus looked at his friend and his head was ringing. Something is wrong here. At that moment, Dylan fell silent and his face began to change. He seemed to freeze for a moment and then calmly replied, "No, Mark, you said it yourself. I'm just listening." The words echoed in Marcus's head, and something inside him shrank from the cold. Marcus abruptly pushed back his chair and stood up, feeling a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong. Dylan didn't say anything about this board in the photo. The inner feeling of anxiety was growing by the second. He remembered how the photos of the clowns, which seemed strange, began to bother him more and more after he brought her home. And now, when Dylan mentioned the smell of burnt rubber, which he could not possibly know, the puzzles began to add up. "I'll probably go," Marcus said softly, stepping back. Dylan looked up, his face surprisingly calm. Only the eyes seemed too empty, like those clowns in the photo. Suddenly, Marcus found it difficult to breathe, as if something heavy was squeezing his chest. "Why are you in such a hurry?" Dylan's voice became a little strange, as if it did not come from his throat, but from somewhere outside, like an echo. Marcus didn't want to answer. Didn't want to stay here for a second longer. His hands were shaking and he was trying to find the keys in his pocket, but his fingers wouldn't obey. He walked to the door, feeling as if something sticky had wrapped around his legs, slowing his steps. His thoughts were mixed up. He just needed to get out of here, get out and go home. But why? There was something wrong at home too. "You left them alone," Marcus heard as his hand touched the door handle. He turned around and saw that Dylan was still sitting in place, but his expression had become completely inhuman. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The emptiness that had been in the clown photos was now firmly embedded in that look. It was as if he knew something that Marcus himself didn't. "They're following you," Dylan continued slowly. "You woke them up, and now they won't leave." Those words echoed in Marcus's mind. He threw open the door and ran outside, his heart beating like crazy. The wind was in his face, and the cold night greeted him with a sharp gust. Getting into the car, he began to start the engine with trembling hands, but the car did not give in. Adrenaline was pumping in his head, and Marcus felt that if he didn't leave right now, something terrible would happen. He slammed the steering wheel violently, and the engine finally rumbled. Marcus drove out onto the road without looking back. But even outside of Dylan's house, the feeling of anxiety did not go away. It seemed like something was following him. He knew it wasn't just thoughts. It wasn't just paranoia. Every time he looked back in the rearview mirror, it seemed to him that for a moment he saw there the clown. When he got to his apartment, Marcus immediately closed the door with several locks. His breathing was heavy, and his thoughts were more and more like chaos. He looked around slowly, trying to convince himself that it was all a figment of his imagination. But there was that smell in the air again. Burnt rubber. The board and the photograph were lying quietly on the shelf. He came closer, and the photo caught his attention again. New details have appeared on the image. The figure in the center of the circle of clown children has now become clearer. It was something dark, indistinguishable, but it got closer, as if the figure had moved forward. But the scariest thing was that the number of clowns in the photo had changed. There were more of them now than before. Marcus shook his head, trying to shake off the vision. He wanted to get rid of these things, throw them away, burn them. But something held him back, as if the photograph itself and the Ouija board were clinging to his consciousness. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Marcus froze. Who could come at such a time? Slowly, as if in slow motion, he went to the door and looked through the peephole. Empty. The silence outside the door was deafening. But then again, knock, knock, knock. This sound, so dull and rhythmic, came from the other side, as if someone was deliberately playing with his nerves. Who's there? Marcus's voice was trembling, but there was no answer. He looked through the peephole again, but saw nothing. Fear held him down. His hands went to the door handle again, and as soon as he opened it, nothing. An empty corridor. No one. But the feeling that something was nearby was too real. And then he saw them again. In the distance, at the end of the corridor, stood a figure in a clown costume. She didn't move, just stared in his direction. Marcus froze in place, cold sweat running down his back. He couldn't take his eyes off the figure at the end of the corridor. The clown was wearing a bright red suit with a wide smile painted on his face. His eyes were hidden by shadows, but his posture seemed unnatural, as if he was broken or damaged. He didn't move, but his presence was palpable, like an impending threat, ready to collapse at any moment. Marcus slowly closed the door, as if trying to get rid of the vision, to return reality to its usual course. But there was still the smell of burnt rubber in the room, which became even more intense, thick, as if everything around was saturated with this suffocating aroma. He walked away from the door and leaned against the wall, trying to collect his thoughts. Panic began to take over his mind, but he knew that if he succumbed to fear, he would only make things worse. He looked at the Ouija board. It was still lying on the shelf, covered with a thin layer of dust. At that moment, something inside him clicked. This is not just an antique toy or souvenir. It clearly had some connection with everything that was happening. But how? Marcus walked over to the board, feeling something squishy under his feet. He stopped, looked down, and froze. The floor beneath him was covered with wet, dirty footprints, as if someone had walked through the apartment barefoot, leaving a wet trail behind them. The footprints led from the door directly to the Ouija board. He felt the board, his fingers felt its rough surface, worn by time. It was more than just an old item. Marcus felt that the board was somehow alive. He remembered the words on the back of the photo. "Don't wake them up, they know the way to you." It all seemed like a bad dream, but the sense of reality was too strong to ignore. A sharp sound broke the silence. It was a phone. Marcus jumped in surprise. The display read, "Number unknown." His hand was shaking as he held the phone to his ear. "Marcus?" A hoarse voice came from the receiver. "You do realize what you've done, don't you?" The voice sounded distant, as if someone was whispering from the other end of a long, dark corridor. "Who is this?" Marcus tried to keep the fear out of his voice, but his voice was hoarse and trembling. "You woke them up. Now they're coming for you. You can't leave." Marcus dropped the phone. His heart was beating so hard that it seemed like his chest was about to burst. He went back to the door and looked through the peephole again. The corridor was empty. The clown disappeared. But this fact did not bring any relief. Rather the opposite. The unknown was even scarier. Deciding not to sit idly by, Marcus went to the shelf and grabbed the photo. Now the central figure was clearly visible on it. It was the same clown he had seen in the corridor. But the scariest thing was that his own face now appeared in the picture. Among the children in clown costumes, his eyes were empty, like the others. Marcus rushed to the front door, trying to run out of the apartment, but the clown met him outside the door. He was standing right in front of him, his face distorted by an unnatural, strained smile. This time, the clown was closer than ever, and his hands reached out to Marcus. He stepped back, tripped and fell, knocking the Ouija board off the shelf. She hit the floor with a thud, and a strange, booming sound rolled through the apartment. The room seemed to tilt. The walls began to press down, and everything around slowed down, as if in slow motion. The clown took a step forward. Marcus tried to crawl back, but bumped into furniture. His breathing became rapid and ragged. He couldn't take his eyes off the monstrous figure that was getting closer. The clown was very close now. His face loomed over him, and for a second, there was something alien, unearthly in his eyes. And then he heard footsteps behind him. Before he could turn around, he felt cold hands on his shoulders. Marcus was stunned. He felt something cold and viscous wrap around his arms, squeezing like a noose. He couldn't turn around, but he knew that someone else was standing behind him, something that had come out of the darkness to share him with the horror he was already experiencing. One of the window frames shattered with a crash. He panicked, desperately trying to free his hands from the grip, but it was useless. There was something looking at him from behind that he couldn't even think about. A figure with burning eyes and a crazy smile that filled his entire field of vision. He could hear whispers, sounds like laughter echoing around him, as if playing on his fears. "You woke us up," said something from behind, his voice distorted, as if a whole multitude of beings were talking at the same time. "We've been waiting for you. You're ours now." At that moment, memories of the photo with the clowns flashed through Marcus's mind. He remembered looking at their empty eyes, at their crazy smile, at how they stood around that vague figure. Words from old stories about cursed dolls and evil spirits that could enter this world began to play in his mind like an ominous melody. The clown leaned closer. His face was now very close to Marcus's face. He could feel his breath, cold, moist, with the smell of rot. Every breath made his heart beat faster, making his blood run cold. "We're going to play," the clown said with a nasty laugh. "Let's play hide and seek." Marcus screamed when his body wouldn't move. He knew that this moment was his last, and at the same time he understood that, for clowns, it was only the beginning. They never left their world. He had allowed them into his life, and now he would be part of their game. The deep shadows behind him began to take shape, rapidly enlarging and spreading across the room. The clowns lined up in a row, their smiles getting wider and their eyes getting emptier. At this time, he felt his hands clench even tighter. Every muscle in Marcus's body was in agony. He was fighting, but he knew there was no way out. He closed his eyes, and at the same moment, he let out a terrible scream. But the moment the sound came out of his mouth, everything froze. He opened his eyes and saw his own body sitting on the floor, staring into space, while the clowns continued to laugh, their voices merging into one creepy dance. Marcus realized that he had become a part of them. He became the figure in the photo. He couldn't get out anymore. His soul was trapped in this cycle, a cycle of fear, endlessly repeated over and over again. Laughter rang out in his head, soft at first, then getting louder, encompassing his entire being. He watched the clowns dancing around him, playing hide and seek, and realized that he had become a part of them. The shadow of the clown shifted towards him, and he suddenly felt his own lips stretch into the same smile he had seen on their faces. It wasn't just a game. This was his new existence.